Darktide has arrived, and it's time to jump into the action, but where do you start? Hey there friends, it's Kodiak here, welcome to Legacy Gaming. Today we're sharing everything you need to know about the starting classes in Warhammer 40K Darktide and helping you pick the best option for your playstyle. Right off the bat, we have to make it clear, this video is coming out right at the launch of Darktide. As things develop, this video might become a bit outdated as new classes get added into the mix. Consider this your 101 video, a crash course on how to get started in Darktide with the 4 classes that are available at launch. Now there's 2 layers to how classes work in this game. The macro level is called the Archetype. There are 4 currently in the game. You've got the Veteran, a battle-hardened soldier of the Astra Militarum, the Zealot, a steadfast, loyal subject of the God Emperor, the Ogryn, large, powerful brutes that are often exploited and utilized for their incredible strength, and the Psykers, consider witches throughout the Imperium because of their connection to the Immaterium. These 4 archetypes define the general characteristics of each class, loosely defining how the character will play, but it's really the second layer that determines how a class performs in the moment-to-moment action, and that, my friends, is why you're here. So with that basic knowledge under our belts, let's dive in to the first class. When it comes to the Veteran archetype, things couldn't be more straightforward than the Sharpshooter class. This is easily one of the most foundational combinations in the game when you consider every factor, such as abilities and gameplay. From a 30,000-foot perspective, the Veteran Sharpshooter is your classic mid-range soldier that utilizes rifles to deal damage from a distance and has the ability to deal increased damage to elite and special enemies through its ability and tactical loadout. The class is designed almost with support in mind, and while capable of dealing insane amounts of damage, the Sharpshooter performs best when surrounded by a gaggle of teammates that take the pressure off the Veteran. When loading in, the Veteran Sharpshooter has the standard issue Unitorm Sapper Shovel and the Cantrell Mark 7 Lasgun. Alongside the Sharpshooter's Frag Grenade, this is a potent combination when it comes to dealing significant damage to the full spectrum of enemies in Darktide. Where things get a bit more interesting is when you consider how the Sharpshooter's passive effect, called Iconics, and coherency bonus, called an Aura, factor into the gameplay. The first passive, Make Every Shot Count, gives the Sharpshooter a 15% increase to damage when hitting enemy weak spots. In the chaos of battle, this isn't always easy, but if you're someone that does have decent aim, you're going to notice this effect in nearly every situation, especially when confronted with some of the bigger enemies in the game, such as the Plague Ogryns. The other effect, Be Prepared, is where the Sharpshooter's ranged combat nature comes into scope. This passive increases weapon reserves by 75%. So, for example, if a weapon would normally have 300 rounds, this effect will net you 225 more, bringing your total ammo reserves up to 525 rounds. It's a pretty remarkable effect that plays out in a big way during the action. While your friends are off scrounging for ammo, you're in the back line firing away, still with plenty left in reserve. The Sharpshooter isn't entirely selfish though, and its aura makes that clear. Scavenger Hunt returns ammo to you and your nearby teammates whenever an elite enemy is killed. Now it's an important note, elite enemies are different than specialist enemies such as net grabbers. If you are someone that relies on ranged combat, this is a big deal as elite enemies are extremely common in the harder difficulties, meaning this effect triggers a lot more often, benefiting your team a heck of a lot more. The next thing we have to consider at a base level is the Sharpshooter's class ability, Volley Fire. The Sharpshooter enters a ranged stance for 4 seconds, instantly equipping their ranged weapon and designating nearby elite and specialist enemies as priority targets. During this stance, the Sharpshooter deals 50% increased damage. What's important to note about this, and really all abilities, is how frequently you can use them. Unlike in Vermintide 2, where you can find potions to recharge your abilities, that effect happens passively just by fighting through waves of enemies. Comparatively, you're going to be using your abilities far more often in Darktide than you did in Vermintide 2, so there's no real point in waiting for that perfect moment since it's so easy to recharge your ability. Volley Fire solidifies the Sharpshooter as an elite enemy killer, and when you look at the complete package, it all comes together to form the perfect soldier. From the increased ammo supply, to the quick burst of damage you can get from a well-placed frag grenade, to the class ability that gives you a 50% damage boost to elite enemies, the Sharpshooter is a master at dispatching priority targets and mowing down waves of enemies with one well-placed shot after the next. The final factor to consider are the veteran skills, or talents as they're more commonly known in the game. There's not a lot that will surprise you here, but a few I'd like to highlight as I think they paint a more complete picture of what the Sharpshooter brings to the table. In the second group, you'll see the Sniper skill, which boosts the damage of the Sharpshooter by up to 25% based on the distance the player is away from the enemy. Another skill, this time in the third tree, is Demolition Team, which grants the player and allies in Coherency an 8% chance to gain a grenade on enemy kill. This is an absolute game changer in my mind, as the number of enemies you kill in a round is staggering. With nearly a 1 in 10 chance to gain a grenade on kill, it's one of the most potent skills at the Sharpshooter's disposal. Finally, in the fifth tree, I want to call out Deadshot, which is just insane if you ask me. While looking down the sights of the weapon, the Sharpshooter has a 25% increased crit chance and a 95% reduction to sway, but you do lose 10% stamina every second. In my opinion, the stamina trade-off here is well worth it, as it makes the Sharpshooter that much more deadly on the battlefield. If we consider everything, it should be abundantly clear that the veteran Sharpshooter is all about ranged combat. I mean, it's a no-brainer. If you prefer to approach Darktide like a more traditional FPS, this is the class for you. I mean, heck, there are even skills you can take that make you less likely to get targeted while standing still and shooting. It's actually pretty funny how simple they're making this class, because honestly, I think it's a good baseline for the veteran archetype. Want to stand in one place and shoot las guns? Check. Want to deal insane damage while doing that? Check. Want to have nearly endless supplies of ammo while raining down a hail of lasers? Check, check, and check. At the end of the day, the Sharpshooter might not be the most interesting class, but it damn sure might be the most effective, and that, my friends, is all that really matters. If you're looking for something that splits the difference between ranged and melee combat, look no further than the Zealot, specifically the Zealot Preacher. This is the first class available for the Zealot archetype, and again, is very foundational in nature, but does provide players with a more balanced option when it comes to fighting both in melee and at a distance. And even though that distance might not be as profound as some of the other starting classes, it's still a decent balance when you consider and look at the 4 available classes at launch. For starters, the Zealot Preacher loads in with a combat axe for melee and the auto pistol for ranged. Now, as you might expect, that auto pistol is nowhere near as effective once you get past around 10 meters, but that doesn't mean it isn't effective altogether. In fact, in combination with your melee weapon, the Zealot's ability to switch between melee and ranged is actually what makes the class so damn effective for this style of game. That gets even better when you consider some of the other ranged options the Zealot gets access to, like the shotguns, but that's a topic for another day. The Zealot Preacher also gets the Tactical Stun Grenade, which is essentially an AoE stun grenade that combines debilitating gas and some flashes. This is great for those hectic moments when you just need a second to breathe, and has a decent enough effective AoE that you can really make the most out of this thing even when thrown in the thick of the action. Together, the Zealot's loadout is effective, but it's only when you understand the full scope of the Preacher's kit that you can appreciate what they truly bring to the table. The Zealot Preacher's first passive is Swift Exorcism, which increases their melee attack speed by 10%. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple to understand. The second passive, Until Death, gives the Preacher the ability to go invulnerable for 5 seconds when hit with an attack that would otherwise kill them. This is a quintessential frontline defensive passive that makes a lot of sense for a class like the Preacher. The downside is you can only trigger this effect every 90 seconds, so a bit of a cooldown period that you might or might not feel the effects of depending on your skill level. The final passive is Martyrdom, which increases the Preacher's damage by 5 for every 15 health the player is missing, stacking up to 3 times. So with 45 health missing, you get a maximum benefit of plus 15 to your damage. Notice that they don't specify what type of damage is increased, whether it be melee or ranged, which is great because that means both get the increased benefits, which plays right into the ebb and flow of the Zealot Preacher's playstyle, dancing between ranged and melee combat. As far as the Preacher's coherency buff, or aura, well, it's nothing fancy, just a flat 10% reduction to toughness damage. That means it'll take 10% more damage from enemies before breaking that pseudo-overshield the developers have implemented within the game. Keep in mind, this only applies to allies within coherency range. Now, to further add to the chaos, let's consider the Preacher's class ability, Chastise the Wicked. When activated, the Preacher dashes forward or towards a targeted enemy, replenishing all toughness, increasing the damage of the next melee hit by 25%, and making it a guaranteed critical hit. This is both an offensive and utility ability that players can use in a variety of situations. The most standard use case is going to be when the Preacher wants to charge into the action. Because of the additional toughness and damage benefits, it makes the most sense to use this as an engagement tool, but you can also use Chastise the Wicked to disengage from a fight say if your toughness is gone and you're 1 or 2 shots away from being dead. It's a great rush-style ability that has a lot of flexibility and is really only limited by the player's imagination, and the range of the charge, of course. Zealot Preacher skills are pretty lackluster up until the final 2 trees. A lot of what you'll see before that is increases to your defensive capabilities, specifically through toughness. This, of course, plays into some of the things we've already talked about, like the passive Until Death and the Emperor's Will, the coherency bonus we mentioned before. When it comes to offensive capabilities, however, things get pretty incredible once you reach the right skills. If you want to lean into a more ranged Preacher build, you can check out Emperor's Executioner in the 5th tree, which increases your gun damage by 20% based on your proximity to the target. I would imagine, although it doesn't outright say it, the closer you are, the more damage you do. That would make the most sense. In that same tree is also Rising Conviction, which gives you a plus 5% damage increase for 5 seconds on hit. This stacks up to 5 times, which means you can receive a plus 25% flat damage increase. Insane. In the final tree are some more ridiculous skills like Invocation of Death, which reduces the cooldown of your class ability by 1 second for every melee critical hit. You could also opt for Purge the Wicked, which gives your class ability another charge entirely. Most of the Zealot Preacher skills amplify the class's melee and defensive capabilities, which makes sense, as it's one of the most flexible classes on the front line. Depending on the needs of your party, the skills are also malleable to the situation, which you really can't say about some of the other classes. If you want to build a DPS Preacher, you can absolutely do that, but if you wanted to focus more on survivability, say for those higher difficulty levels, well, you can do that too. There's a skill for nearly every playstyle, and that makes the Zealot Preacher a force to be reckoned with. If I'm being honest, the Zealot Preacher really didn't sell me before I had a chance to play it myself. What most players will absolutely love about the class is its ability to dance amongst the chaos. That's where it shines. Switching between melee and ranged isn't necessarily about switching between close quarters combat and mid-range combat. It's just a different approach to how you cut down enemies within a 10 to 15 meter radius of your character. I wouldn't say the class is a beginner class, because to survive in the chaos, you need to know the limitations of the class, which is why I think the Zealot Preacher might actually fit the bill for more experienced players, or those who are coming over from Vermintide 2. The Preacher brings a lot to the table as a frontline class, specifically health management, high damage melee combat, and an aptitude for dealing with armored enemies, but that all depends on how you build out the character's skills. Secretly, I think this class will be a sleeper hit amongst the community, and it all comes down to the flexibility Fat Shark is providing players so that they can live amongst the chaos. If you're looking for a big, meaty shield that stands on the front lines, squashing enemies left and right, look no further than the Ogryn Skullbreaker. I don't think anyone ever doubted that the first Ogryn class would be melee-focused, but it's how much Fat Shark leans into this idea of an Ogryn frontline that really cements the idea. The class is designed with one thing in mind: how to be the most effective frontline out there. And while other classes like the Zealot Preacher have the ability to dance in and around short to mid-range as needed, to be an effective Ogryn Skullbreaker, you have to live right on the edge of chaos and destruction. Upon loading in, a Skullbreaker will be equipped with a club, fitting, and a thumper shotgun. It's the latter that's a bit interesting, as this starting shotgun is a one-pump wonder, dealing high damage but only when used in extreme close range. The reload time is also longer than one might expect, which makes it more of a supporting player to the main star of the show, the Skullbreaker's melee attacks. To complement this loadout is the Ogryn's tactical item, the Grenade Box. This is a brilliantly hilarious item, as the Ogryn literally chucks an entire box of grenades at his enemy. Funny thing is, while it deals an insane amount of single target damage, it doesn't actually explode, so this box acts more like a sniper projectile than anything else. If you think about it though, this makes a lot of sense. This tactical item gives the Ogryn the ability to deal some serious damage to elite enemies, foes they'll most likely be going toe-to-toe with anyways. It's an on-demand nuke, but with reward comes risk. This tactical is a single projectile, so if you miss, you get nothing. No damage, no explosion, no AoE, nothing. It's a great item, but one that requires a bit of skill to use effectively. For a frontline meat shield, the Ogryn Skullbreaker has passive buffs you'd pretty much expect. Excessive Force gives the player a 25% increase to stagger strength for all melee attacks. That means when hitting enemies, they'll be knocked back just a bit further than any other class. Loyal Protector makes the Ogryn a Revive King. When reviving or assisting allies, a Skullbreaker can't be interrupted. And the final passive, Thick Skin, gives the player a 20% toughness damage reduction, as well as a flat 20% damage reduction from all sources. If the Skullbreaker didn't scream frontline tank before, It sure should now. Let's also factor in the class's aura Intimidating Presence, which increases the heavy melee attack damage of allies by 10% so long as they're in coherency range. I'll be frank, I'm not wild about this aura. It definitely brings less to the table than the other classes. Heavy melee attacks are a bit niche and most of the time are only used when absolutely necessary to deal with specific enemies, so for this aura to only impact the damage of those attacks is a bit cheap when you consider some of the other auras in the game which have much broader implications. Where the aura does matter though is in the higher difficulties when you'll be facing many more armored enemies. It's got a place in the game, that's for sure, but it's more specific to the situation. The Skullbreaker's class ability is Bull Rush. This is kind of like the Zealot Preacher's Charge, but also not. It's mainly used as a way to disrupt a massive horde of enemies. When activated, the Skullbreaker charges forward, knocking back all enemies it hits. At the end of the charge, the player also has increased movement and attack speed. It can be used as both an offensive and defensive tool, but its main use is to really create some sort of disruption when things are getting hairy. The ability can also be used to push enemies off of ledges, careening them to their death. There are a lot of enemies in Darktide, and having a way to give your team some breathing room is something you shouldn't underestimate, which is why this ability is nice to have, plus the buffs are nice too. As you might expect, the Skullbreaker has a lot of skills that increase their resilience on the battlefield. I would say a good 80% of them tap into toughness and sustainability in some meaningful way, and that's fine, because that's what this class is all about. There are some interesting skills like Heavyweight in Row 2 that increases your damage and improves damage reduction by 50% to specific enemies like Bulwarks, Crushers, and Plague Ogryns, while other skills are a bit more all-encompassing in nature, like Bullfighter, which speeds up the cooldown of Bull Rush by 10% for every elite enemy you or a coherency ally kills. I also love that so many of the skills lean into Bull Rush, enhancing it for the player. We've seen this with some of the other skill trees, but the developers really make it a centerpiece for the Skullbreaker, especially later on in the tree. While some may not see it as a fundamental necessity of the class, it can be enhanced via the skills to become the cornerstone of an effective Skullbreaker. If it's not clear, the Skullbreaker belongs on the front lines, with an array of powerful weapons to unlock and a toolkit that screams Meat Shield. There's nothing better than having one of these Ogryns on your team, taking fire and cutting down any enemies that get in the way. In terms of accessibility, this class is probably one of the most straightforward and fun to play. If you're new to Darktide, Ogryn is just simple. Swing a big beefy club, break out a shotgun when you want to change of pace, and charge through your enemies like the bull that you are. Because of all the defensive enhancements, it makes the Skullbreaker a bit more forgiving than, say, the veteran Sharpshooter, who doesn't have quite the same level of sustain. So again, if you're new or just not that skilled, this class has a lot of built-in forgiveness. Don't get it twisted though, the Ogryn Skullbreaker is a menace in the hands of a capable player, especially once some of the better weapons are unlocked, which is why it's a class I think everyone should explore at some point during their adventures. If you're looking for something a bit different with your gameplay in Darktide, then look no further than the Psyker Psykinetic. Easily the most unique class of the 4 starters, the idea here is simple: create a 40k mage. Now, of course, I'm oversimplifying, but that's how it's going to feel to some players. That's because the Psykinetic is built around a unique set of abilities and skills, more so than any other class in the game, at least at this point. It's the first class where the weapons play second fiddle to the abilities, and I, for one, love that about the class. When loading into a new Psykinetic, players will start with a standard Force Sword, as well as a revolver. I'll be honest, they both take a backseat to the rest of the Psykinetic's kit, but they do have a place in the build. As we'll discuss, having magical powers only goes so far, and when those things are tapped out, you'll need some steel or lead to hold you over. The most important part of a Psykinetic's kit, however, is its tactical ability or blitz ability, Brain Burst. This is really the class's bread and butter and stands apart from the grenades and consumable items of the other classes. Brain Burst is a magical ability. When targeting an enemy, players can begin channeling this spell, and after a short duration, deal extremely high single target damage to an enemy. This ability can be used on nearly every target in the game, including enemies hiding behind shields, which is why it's such a potent attack. When an elite enemy is standing between your team and your objective, it's always nice to have a Psykinetic around that can burst the brain of an enemy that would otherwise take a small army to bring down. As you use Brain Burst, players will have to mine their peril, which is a resource that builds up as you use your blitz ability. Peril is tricky. At 100%, it doesn't outright kill you unless you do one more cast of Brain Burst, at which case you instantly die. You can quell your peril, essentially using a channel effect to lower your peril steadily, but that does take you out of combat while channeling. It's a complicated resource, one that you need to learn to manage, as there are a number of factors that make playing with high peril more fruitful for the player, but that's a topic for another video. I mentioned that the Psykinetic is a unique class in the intro, and that's really the case when you factor in the rest of the kit, including the passive bonuses. The first passive is Warp Siphon. Every time you kill an enemy with Brain Burst, you gain a warp charge. Each warp charge grants you a plus 3% damage increase, and from the time the buff is applied, you have 20 seconds to capitalize on the effect, and you can stack it up to 4 times, which means you can have a total damage increase of 12% if you manage to kill 4 targets with Brain Burst within the buff window. The second effect, Inner Tranquility, is a bit of a throwaway because it just reduces the peril generated by 10%. It's pretty clear, at least to me, that this is meant to set up the Psyker for future classes. Why would the one class available have a blanket reduction in its core gameplay system if more classes weren't also tapping into that system? Silly at face value, but should make sense in the long run. I think the idea here is to make the Psykinetic the Brain Burst class, and perhaps future classes will tap into different Psyker potential while still utilizing the peril resource. Hard to say at this point. The final passive is the Psykinetic's Aura Kinetic Presence, which increases the damage your allies in coherency range deal to elites by 10%. This is a solid buff, especially on the harder difficulties, which adds a lot of value to the class when it comes to group composition. We've already established that Brain Burst is a big part of the Psykinetic's kit, while the class's active ability, Psykinetic's Wrath, is what really seals the deal in terms of making this class all about the Brain Burst. When activated, this ability resets the player's peril and staggers enemies in front of the Psykinetic. This is huge when you consider how easy it is to build up your peril meter, and doubly important when you consider it's almost required to build up to 4 stacks of Warp Siphon. In theory, the idea is to Brain Burst 2 enemies, then reset your peril with Psykinetic's Wrath, then Brain Burst 2 more enemies, thus acquiring that 12% damage increase. Without the active ability, you're pretty much stuck at 2 stacks, waiting for your peril to drop, and by the time it does drop, you've almost lost that first buff. Unlike some of the other active abilities in the game, Psykinetic's Wrath is about setting up the player for success through careful planning and execution of a rotation. Once you acquire those buffs, you can tap into your melee and ranged weapons if you want and capitalize on the damage increase, or as you'll come to find out with some of the higher end gameplay, continue to use Brain Burst. If we look at the Psykinetic skills, you'll notice a pattern. Everything with this class leans into the Brain Burst ability. It makes sense as it's the single most defining thing about the class. There are, however, some interesting skills that can inform your gameplay depending on your style. For example, Psykinetic's Wrath in row 2 allows you to gain between 5 to 15% more force weapon damage based on your current peril. Another great skill is Cerebral Lacerations in the 3rd row. When an enemy is hit with Brain Burst, they take 15% more damage from all non-warp sources for 5 seconds. This adds a lot of value to the Psykinetic's team support, and considering how many elite enemies you face in the harder difficulties is almost essential once you reach a certain difficulty. Finally, I want to point out Kinetic Flare in the 5th row, which gives all your attacks a 10% chance to Brain Burst the target. The effect can only happen once every 15 seconds, and only when not at critical peril, but still an easy way to proc a massive spike of damage. As I said, nearly all the skills lean into Brain Burst. It's just a matter of exactly how you, as the player, want to approach this unique class. The Psykinetic is unique, and it takes a special type of player to appreciate all the nuances it brings to the table. It's a class that's got a lot of frills, which takes some time to master. While it's true that every class is accessible, we shouldn't ignore the fact that some classes, more so than others, have a higher skill ceiling. The Psyker is one of those archetypes, and the Psykinetic one of those classes. Capable of dealing insane amounts of single target damage, especially to high priority targets, it comes at a cost. Very few physical tools to defend yourself. Weapons are an afterthought on the Psykinetic, but are an effective last line of defense when things get dire. If you're a player that has the patience to learn when to tempt fate and when to hide behind your teammates, I think you'll get immense joy out of playing the Psyker Psykinetic. When it comes to picking the best starting class in Darktide, of course that's a non-question, as any class can be effective in the right hands. But to do this thing justice, I think we need to summarize the developer's intentions for each of the 4 launch classes. The Veteran Sharpshooter is meant to be a mid-range soldier that relies on ranged weapons to take down enemies, specifically elite and special enemies that they can target with their class ability and weak point enhancements. The Zealot Preacher is designed as a frontline warrior with an aptitude for living in the chaos, utilizing both melee and ranged weapons to great effect. Their special ability allows them to engage or disengage as the situation demands, and their ranged weapon gives them enough flexibility that they can make an impact even when they need to step away from the fight, if only just for a second. The Ogryn Skullbreaker, well, they are your true frontline tank. Big and beefy, their entire kit is designed around surviving the onslaught of enemies that will no doubt be rushing straight for them. They are the living embodiment of a meat shield. Finally, the Psyker Psykinetic, 40k's version of the glass cannon mage. Their unique brain burst ability is the key to their high single target damage, but with that power comes a fragility that makes them a high skill ceiling character. The class is one of the most potent currently in the game, but it takes practice to make the most impact on the battlefield. The Sharpshooter, Preacher, Skullbreaker, and Psykinetic all bring something different to the table, but hopefully one of them will resonate with you as you step into Fat Shark's latest Warhammer game. As always, friends, if you enjoy our content, do me a favor, hit that thumbs up, and consider subscribing. We'll be covering Darktide top to bottom, so don't miss out if you want more Warhammer 40k in your feeds. I'm also excited to announce that our first ever Legacy Gaming merch is now available. You can head to our website, legacygaming.gg/shop, to pick up shirts, hoodies, and a hat. The designs are pretty awesome, and we'll be adding even more in the future. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.